A very warm welcome to everyone this afternoon. It's a pleasure to host the IMA SRK lecture, which is made possible due to a wonderful grant from the SRK Foundation. We have with us uh, Mr. Yagnik, who is the president of the SRK Foundation, as well as Professor Eric Hanushek, who is at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Uh, Professor Hanushek is well known to people who work in the economics of education. He was amongst the first persons who started to work on issues like what happens if you reduce class sizes, or how do you measure teacher quality. And he showed a close connection between teacher quality and student learning outcomes. And some of that work started to get replicated in other parts of the world. And I may mention that currently, actually, we are also in conversation with parts of the Indian government, which is trying to actually, implement some of this in India. What exactly are student learning outcomes? Okay. He has a phenomenal amount of work in the area, as I said, but to my mind, there is a recent book which I flipped through, which is on the knowledge capital of nations, which talks about how skills is closely related to economic growth, but is also talking about how that is linked with high quality education, high quality schooling. Okay. In a world in which we are talking about universal basic income, he had a book on universal basic skills. Okay. And talking about how the value of basic skills is important for nations when they think about their growth. He's been a PhD, he did his PhD at MIT, he's worked at the University of Rochester and Yale, he's a fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research as well as the IZA Labor Institute. It's a pleasure to have you out here. I can still remember that at one time, if I'm right, you were also on a commission, you were a commissioner on an Excellence and Equity Commission of the Department of Education. And I've always thought India desperately needs, a commission to look at this trade-off in education between excellence and equity, which is, staring us starkly in the face today, and which is a very important policy question which, we've been grappling with, and somehow we've not been able to come out with answers which are satisfactory, both for in terms of socio-political outcomes as well as from the point of view of economic growth. Okay. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for visiting. We look forward to your lecture, but before that, I would hand over the floor to Mr. Yagnik to say a few words on behalf of SRK Foundation.
Namaste. Thank you, Professor Errol. In 2016, when we signed a 25-year contract with IIMA, we thought it will accrue benefit to our organization. SRK Knowledge Foundation, it is an offshoot of SRK Diamonds Company. And this diamond company, as we know, that Surat is a capital of diamonds. 90% of the diamonds are cut and polished in this city. And SRK Diamond Company is situated in Surat. It is India's one of the lead diamond manufacturing company. The founder of this company, Govind Dholakia, having absolutely no formal education of any kind, he was always fond of education. And the value of education he knows, and what the learning is all about. Like to study and to learn, there are two different things. And keeping this ideal in mind, he said that let's promote research, let's invite researchers, let's ask and create a culture of knowledge across the globe. And keeping that idea in mind, he set aside to the tune of around 500 crore to begin with to set up these foundations. So today, I am here on behalf of Govindbhai Dholakia, and I am really thankful that IIMA accepted our efforts, and today after 4 years, after the lecture which we started with Professor Raghuram Rajan, then subsequently we had a Nobel laureate, Professor Muskin, and last year we had Professor Dr. Partho Dasgupta, and today, we are fortunate that we have with us, Professor Eric, who is going to talk about education. And the knowledge capital, what Professor Errol talked about, it concludes that there is a direct link between the quality of education and the economic growth of the nations. And today, we know that the nation, the economic growth of our nation is its lowest in last 11 years. So what is the reason? We will learn from Professor Eric Muskin. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those introductions, kind introductions. Listing the prior people who have given this lecture is a bit intimidating, and so I will try to deal with the intimidation of following that group of speakers. I should say that this is the first time I've been here to the university. I've known of the graduates of this university, but never have seen the university and its faculty before, and so I'm pleased for the opportunity to be here. What I want to talk about today was already in the introduction. I want to talk about the economic value of knowledge and skills. This is something that I think most people in most nations, if you ask them about the economic value of skills, they would say, yes, education is very important. And to that I respond, almost everybody who nods their head and says that underestimates the value of education for the future of nations. And that's what I hope to sketch out today, is a general statement of what I see from around the world, and then end with a few little mentions of where India stands and what is frankly the challenge facing the Indian nation. So that's my plan for today. Technology has defeated me already. In 2015, the United Nations passed the Sustainable Development Goals. This actually followed on from 15 years prior to that, where they had the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals were more modest, and they said we should make sure that everybody gets basically a middle high school education, that the health of the population is good and people have good incomes. When it came close to 2015, when the Millennium Development Goals were supposed to have been met, they realized they weren't going to be met. So the United Nations met to pass some even more ambitious goals. And that's what we have in front of you. The 17 goals include, by the year 2030, we should eliminate poverty. We should eliminate hunger. We should equalize incomes. We should protect the environment. You could not fault the United Nations for ambition to, in fact, talk about that. But what they didn't indicate, and that I want to emphasize, is that 2 of these 17 goals are much more important in some sense than the other 15, even if you believe in the other 15, which I do. The first one that's more important is number 8, which basically said we have to have economic growth around the world. And the reason why that comes up ahead of the other goals is that there's no way to meet the other goals without having economic growth and without developing the resources. We simply can't redistribute our way to eliminate poverty, eliminate hunger, and improve health we have to, in fact, provide added resources that can be directed in those socially needed ways. The second goal that I would pick out of the 17 is the one I want to talk about today, and that's education. Because there's no way to get economic growth without having a good educational system. The economic growth, in simplest terms, that I hope to demonstrate rather quickly today, the economic growth of a nation is dependent upon the skills of the population. And the skills of the population are what schools are developing and enhancing. So there's where I want to go today. The outline is a very simple outline. I want to talk a little bit about measuring human capital, or the skills of the people. And once we have agreed on my measure of human capital, I hope I can get your agreement fairly quickly on this. Then we'll talk about what is the economic value of these skills, both to individuals and to nations through economic growth. And then I'll end with a quick little discussion of how the current Indian environment fits in to what I'm talking about in terms of education and growth. So that's the plan. Economists have actually been looking at human capital now for over 50 years in a serious way. And in this, it has been very common to measure human capital simply by how much time has people spent in schools. That is convenient in part because every country in the world collects a census data on the amount of schooling that people have. So there are data available on schooling. And long ago, Jacob Mincer demonstrated that you could explain a lot of individual income differences simply by measuring how much schooling they had. And that reinforced the idea that we should measure human capital by years of schooling. That all makes sense except for one thing. It's wrong. And so what I want to show is why it's wrong. The general structure, I think it's close to, the general structure of Jacob Mincer's work, of most economists' work, is to say simply that the outcome, the incomes of people is a function of their human capital and some other things. And that's the basic underlying principle of much of labor economics, is that income is a function of human capital and some other things, and with details on the other things. But the question is it appropriate to just measure human capital by years of schooling? That's what many economists would say, and that's what many macroeconomists have taken to trying to explain economic growth, is that this works for individual incomes, it must work for nations to measure the skills of nations. Except it leaves out one large amount of work that says that the skills of people, human capital, are a very complex function of a variety of things. It involves, as many of you recognize very simply, involves what the family puts into education. Families are extraordinarily important in education. It involves schooling, but it also depends upon the quality of that schooling. Not all schooling is the same. That's why you're here, because not all schooling is the same. You could be at another university, but it's not all the same. And it involves ability and other things, health, what have you, other students in the class. But what this second line of research says is that just measuring human capital by how many years of schooling somebody is in has to be wrong. Okay, there's no other possibility. Well, what I want to do is show you that it's entirely wrong, particularly when we talk about growth of nations and the aggregate impact of skills. I'm going to do that with a very simple relationship. I should say that this little square here is not my square. I presume that's some Indian symbol that means something to you, but we're not, that's an Indian symbol that has been filtered through Microsoft and PowerPoint. This is the first demonstration about measuring human capital, which I'm going to do in a very simple way. I'm going to take standardized test scores of how much math people know as a measure of their skills. And it turns out that that's a fairly good measure. Math skills are correlated with science skills, which are correlated with reading skills, but the qualitative information from the kinds of tests that everybody in this room has taken at one time or another actually are a pretty good measure of skills. Now, what I've done here is taken some recent data on different countries of the world, and countries along here, if you came in the back of the room, you probably can't read any country names. If you came in late and are up front, you can read that we have Singapore here, and we have Greece and the Czech Republic here. But the vertical line here is listed as the returns to skills in the labor market. And what this says is different countries have different labor markets and different policies. But the simple fact is that the more you know in any country of the world, the more you're paid. That's what this says. Now, the height of these graphs is actually what percentage higher would you expect the earnings of somebody to be if they were one standard deviation more in terms of their measured skills, their math skills. So one standard deviation moves you from the median of the 50th percentile to the 86th percentile. If you move there, you see that countries, different countries reward skills differently. So Greece and Czech Republic and Sweden and Norway and Italy are down at this end, where they only give you about 10% higher income over your lifetime if you have one standard deviation more skills. Then you get up to other countries like the US, where I talk about here, where one standard deviation more in skills gives you 28% higher returns each and every year of your life. Okay. So 28% is a pretty big reward for being more skillful. Read the opposite way, which is part of this talk also, read the opposite way, it says the US rewards skills the most, it punishes the lack of skills almost the most. Singapore actually, of the countries we have, does the most of that. They give you almost a 50% higher income through your lifetime for being more skillful, for having one standard deviation more skills. So that's the first story. It says the skills of the population. What this is it says conditional test scores. I'll explain conditional in a minute, but test scores are that for 50 years now, at various times, people have measured math ability of people in different countries around the world in a consistent way. What they do is take a math problem, translate it into the local languages, and just march it around the world and see how many people can solve different math problems. Out of that, you get a measure of the skills of the people. The most recent version of this, which has gotten a lot of attention, is the PISA scores, the Program for International Student Assessment, which is done by the OECD. And now, at this time, 79 countries in 2018 took the same math test in their own language. And that's what's on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis is the long-run growth rate. It's the average annual growth rate between 1960 and 2000. If you're from India, you recognize that growth rates are the thing that determine the future well-being of society, right? If you have zero growth rates, you're going to have the same income today and 50 years from now. And the higher growth rates have an enormous impact that I'm going to show you in a minute. What this shows you, conditional. The only other thing that's taken into account here is the starting income level of the country, the 1960 GDP. This is all measured growth rates in GDP per capita, and we take into account the 1960 GDP. Why? Well, if you start behind, it's easy to grow fast because all you have to do is copy what everybody else does. If you start ahead, you have to invent new things and change the way you produce things and so forth, and that's harder. So getting growth rates is harder. But once you take into account that starting position, what you see is that all of these that are countries, from Peru and South Africa and the Philippines up to Taiwan and Singapore and Korea, all of the countries are actually pretty closely aligned to this straight line. In fact, in statistical terms, we can explain 3/4 of the variation in growth rates across countries by this one factor, by the test scores. Okay? What you don't see from this graph is that that's a very steep line. And I'm going to explain just how steep in 1 second. Before I do that, let me do one other thing. Let me go back to the alternative of saying, what happens if I just use years of schooling, because that's an easy thing to measure. We can have a goal for everybody gets 11 years of schooling in the country. We can measure that. We can have policy set for that. Does that work just as well? Well, in some sense it does. This is conditional years of schooling on the horizontal axis and growth rates from 1960 to 2000 again on the vertical axis. And you see it's all, countries are all aligned in that way, except for one thing, and that is the countries are a little bit farther from this line than the one I showed you before. In fact, this line only explains about 1/4 of the variation in growth rates. But again, the thing that isn't as apparent from this picture is that it's entirely wrong. Okay, let me show you what you get if I just, at the same time as I have years of schooling, take into account the test scores or my achievement measure of the skills of people. You get a perfectly flat line. Okay, this is years of schooling, growth rates, but I've taken into account in the background here how much people know, how well they can do these math problems. Okay. It actually took me a long time to understand this picture, but there is a simple description of this picture. It says if you go to school and don't learn anything, it doesn't count. And that's what this is saying. If you learn something, it counts. If you don't learn anything, it doesn't count. Okay. This, I think, in the simplest terms, summarizes the picture that nations have to concentrate on. The picture is that the quality of schools is ultimately going to determine what the future of the country looks like. Let me do a couple other things before I talked about the magnitude of this. I just showed you pictures about the average achievement of a country. So should we produce rocket scientists or should we have education for all? The two alternatives of basic education skills versus high level of skills. Well, the answer there is, interestingly, both count. Both of them make a difference. It's a little bit hard to judge whether one is more important than the other. But what is the case is that having both is even better than having rocket scientists or basic skills. It turns out that rocket scientists who are making new products, who are developing new production methods and so forth, can be more effective if they have a good workforce. And that's, so they work together of having more high-level workers and along with a basic level of education. The second thing that I'll point out is that it actually turns out having people at the top end is more important in developing countries than in developed countries, because they actually have higher productivity in improving the economies in developing countries. Now, we've done a lot of work on this whole relationship and trying to understand parts of it. One of the parts that I want to emphasize here, because it's relevant to the Indian economy, is that it does make a difference what the economic institutions look like. So what these two graphs are on the right-hand side, countries that have lots of labor and product market protections, rules about how you sell goods, how you have labor and so forth. The ones with the most, that's actually wrong. This is the ones with the most protections. These are reversed somehow. This is the return to education and in terms of growth with and without protection. So the right-hand side one should read, countries with less rigidity in their labor and product markets also have a higher return to skills in the economy, so that the skilled workers are more productive if they have more flexibility in the economy. The left-hand side talks about a similar thing of whether you have an open economy or a closed economy. The more restrictions you have on international trade and the ability to bring products in from abroad, the more restrictions, the less valuable it is to have a skilled population, because they don't have the outside technologies and products to work with, and it gives a smaller return in terms of growth of a skilled population if there's more protection of the economy. So I'm just going to leave it there, but it's a statement that I think has to do with the importance of skills and how they interact with institutions in the labor market. Before going on, I'll just mention at this point, about half the room stands up and says, oh, we see this correlation that you've shown us. Can we assume that this is a causal relationship? In other words, if I can increase the skills of my population, is it reasonable to expect that I can increase the growth rate? Okay, and that's a big question, because I'm reducing my measurement of countries to how many math problems can they solve. So that's a pretty simple measure, right? Well, there's lots of reasons why we should be worried. It could be that if I have higher growth, it causes more skills in the sense that you have more income, you can buy better schools, and then maybe income causes skills instead of skills causing income. Or alternatively, we might have just left out a lot of important factors. There might be cultural factors, there might be institutional factors, and other things that are left out of this, the amount of regulations, what have you. Let me summarize by saying we spent a lot of time, my co-author Ludger Woosman and I have spent a lot of time looking at this problem. Let me just give you one kind of explanation. We've got several, none of which are conclusive, but all of which give strong evidence that in fact this is a causal relationship between skills and growth rates. I said that these tests had been done for 50 years. A number of countries actually have taken these tests over time, and you can trace out changes in the improvement of skills for some countries of the world, where some have improved and some haven't. So what we see is Japan has a high level of skills, but it's been pretty constant, at least as we measure them. Similarly with Korea has a high level of skills, but pretty constant. Finland, which has gotten a lot of attention worldwide because all of a sudden in the early 2000s, they were at the top of the international scales. You can see that they improved over time. This is roughly the straight line you would draw through all the points for each country between 1975 and 2000. We usually show Germany and the US are kind of both low and not showing too much change. And then the one that nobody has ever objected to is, this is Italy. Nobody has any confusion about the fact that the Italian schools are messed up and have done worse over time. Now, if you look at this picture, what this says is that countries that have been doing better in terms of achievement should also see their growth rates getting better. And countries that have been doing worse in terms of the pattern of achievement over time should see their growth rates getting worse. So if I take for each of these countries and just take their annual growth rates over the last 30 years and draw a straight line through all of the annual growth rates. So I'm trying to get rid of all the business cycles and recessions and so forth, and just draw a straight line through them. Countries that have a steep slope in terms of their achievement should have a steeper slope in terms of their growth rates estimated across this time period. Here's the answer. These are the trend or the steepness of the test score relationship. Here's the steepness of the growth rate relationship. And what you see is that it's not perfect, but all the countries are in the right quadrant. The countries at the top of the test score growth are also at the top of the growth rate in their economies. And the countries at the bottom, including Italy, that's down here at the bottom of these countries, are ones that are at the bottom of the test score change and also at the bottom of the growth rates. So this is one example, and we can go into more details, but I think that it's reasonable to presume that this is a causal relationship. That if in fact we can improve the skills of the population as measured by these tests, that not just the test scores, I mean, we could presumably hand out answer sheets for all the PISA tests and improve the scores. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about improving the skills that are measured and correlated with these. So, having done that, what's the value of these? And let me start with the value of different growth rates and different achievement levels. What I'm going to do is give you estimates into the future of improving things. I'm going to use the growth relationship, the picture that I had of how growth rates change with skills, to predict and simulate what the economies of different countries would look like if, in fact, they could improve their skills, their school quality. So I'm going to assume that the future looks just like the past. Okay, strong assumption. I mean, some of the nations that were there in the past won't be there in the future as a nation as a whole. But I'm going to assume that that gives us information about that. And I'm going to look at some feasible changes. So the kinds of changes that I'm going to look at are three changes. I'm first going to look at what would happen if we could bring all of the population in a country up to a basic level of skills. Okay, now basic level in terms of these test scores can be easily described. I'm going to say that the PISA test, which is, as I said, given to 79 nations, has a series of math problems for 15-year-olds. These are tests given to 15-year-olds. And they're being able to solve a level 1 problem, as they define it, is solving the following problem. I flew to India from California. I paid $3,200 for my ticket. My ticket was $3,200, but the exchange rate between the dollar and the euro is 1 to 1.1. How much did my ticket cost in euros? Now, this doesn't sound like a stretch problem for 15-year-olds, but it turns out for the United States, 22% of our 15-year-olds cannot reliably solve a problem like that. And more for lots of other countries. Till you get to Ghana, which is one of the countries, 79 countries that participated in, 92% of the students in Ghana cannot reliably solve that exchange rate problem. Okay, so I'm going to call getting up the basic skills, being able to solve that exchange rate problem. And I'm going to look at what would happen if, in fact, the schools of every country could get all their students, 15-year-olds, up to that level in the next 15 years. Improving schools takes time, and I'm going to pay attention to that. Then I'm going to project out how much different would the economy look like in the future if all the students could solve that problem according to the growth relationship that I showed you before. So this is a simple picture to start with. This is for years in the future. I'm doing it from 2015. For years in the future, I'm actually going to look out 80 years in the future, which is basically the life expectancy of somebody born at the beginning of the period, which is an arbitrary number. And there'll be growth in every one of these countries, except maybe Venezuela. There's growth in every country of the world without changing the schools. And what this is a picture of what growth would look like on average around the world. Then if I improve the schooling according to the growth relationship I had, what I would get was something like the red line, which shows what would growth rate be like with an improved labor force in all the countries. And what I want to show to you is how much difference is that? What's the difference between those two lines? Now, of course, this points out a couple things. One is you don't get the gains immediately. The gains at the start of the period are zero. Why? Everybody's still in school. There's nobody in the labor market, and you got to wait till people get in the labor market and so forth. And so the biggest gains are out in the future, but I'm just going to discount those back to today. Sort of the normal, calculate the present value by discounting these at 3%, or what size investment would we have to have that gave a 3% return and would give us that path of improvement. Okay. So let's look at this. Getting up to basic skills, I'm going to look at a series of lower middle income countries, because this is the poorest countries of the world that have participated in these tests. We've got 200 countries in the world, 79 have taken the PISA test, and those are on average slightly higher income than the people that don't take the test. And what this says is that if the lower income countries, which includes some countries like Ghana, Honduras, Indonesia, and Morocco, are examples of lower middle income countries. If on average they could bring all of their students today up to basic skills, wait till they get out into the labor market, improve the economies of their countries, on average, their income for the rest of the century would be 13% higher. Every year for the rest of the century, they would have 13% more income in the future. You can do the same thing for upper middle income countries, which are Argentina, Bulgaria, South Africa, and Turkey, or high income non-OECD, which is Hong Kong to Russia, Saudi Arabia, lots of Arabian oil countries, basically. And then you have, I've done it again. Then you have at the other end the high-income OECD countries. But even high-income OECD countries would get 3.5% higher average growth for the rest of the century if they could bring all their students, the US students, the Belgian students, et cetera, up to that level. Now we can contrast that to what would happen if we gave everybody just access to basically 9 years of schooling, which is what was called for in the Millennium Development Goals and is embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. And what you see is that that's got much less value by itself, because bringing in more low-skilled people into schools doesn't help you that much. What really helps you is if you can do it for everybody. If you can bring everybody into schools and, in fact, make sure that they're at least minimum quality to get everybody up to basic skill levels. And so what you get here is something like, I think it's a 27% average increase each and every year for the rest of the century for these lower middle income countries. And you get down to still getting almost 15% for these upper middle income countries, the Turkeys and South Africas of the world. Okay. This, I think, if you actually multiply this out in terms of what this means for GDPs of these countries, should convince you that you underestimated the importance of school quality in terms of the impact on future well-being of nations of the world. We can try to add in other countries where I did this with my colleague Ludger Woosman. The OECD gave us what they thought were estimates of India and China's scores. If we went back to the original picture, and I'll come back to it in a little bit, India has not recently participated in any of these tests. China has only participated in the richest parts of China, Shanghai and Beijing, and a couple of rich coastal provinces. The OECD gave us what they thought were reasonable estimates from what they could put together. To add those in 120 other countries that didn't participate in these tests. And what do you get? You get that the present value of the income gains would be 5 times current world GDP. Okay, so if I discount the future growth across all these countries and get the present value of it, it's 5 times the current world GDP. Okay, in fact, you can do it in terms of getting everybody in the world up to basic skills gives you over 6% higher average income each and every year for the rest of the century for all countries of the world, average across the world. Full access gets you 2.5%, but putting the two together, full access into minimal quality schools gets an increase over in terms of present values over the rest of the century of 11%. Okay. This is far beyond what the World Bank ever would envision for the world growth, for the gains that we would get in terms of the economy. Let me just say a few things about individual returns. I'm not going to go into any details here. I've already given you some about the percentage increases. Let me just make a couple remarks. One is, there's just no doubt that higher skills in each and every country of the world gives higher incomes. And so better schools are going to produce higher incomes. One of the things that comes up is, what about getting people into more vocational training as opposed to general skills? What I've been talking about here is general skills, really, cognitive skills. But many countries of the world, including many developing countries, are pushing for increased vocational education so that people are ready to go into jobs immediately. The problem that will come back, I'll show you a picture that does this in a little bit. The problem with that is that if a developing country in fact develops, if in fact it gets higher growth rate, what happens? Well, it changes the way it produces things and what is being produced and how it produces them, which has the possibility of making the vocational skills fully depreciated, worthless, because in fact the production that they've learned how to do has changed. And that's the trade-off that one has to be ready for, because I think this is the picture I wanted to get to. One of the big gains of education is not that it teaches you how to produce something faster. It's not obvious that more educated people actually work better with their hands or whatever. What it does is provide adaptability to change circumstances. And this is a picture that relates to that. The horizontal axis here is the average growth rate in GDP over the last 20 years for countries. And the vertical is exactly the returns to skills that I showed you before for individuals, the one that went from Singapore to Greece. And what you see here is the faster the economy is growing, the higher are the rewards to skills that we see, the returns to skills, because the skills are more adaptable to the changes that occur with a fast-growing economy. This is the concern about vocational education, unless it is provided at the same time with high levels of general cognitive skills that give you the adaptability. The concern that I have in the United States, actually in Europe and in developing countries, is that vocational education is viewed as an alternative for those who aren't getting the general skills in the first place. So that the people that aren't getting any skills, well, we'll give them a trade. And that may work for the first little bit until, in fact, production changes. Let me talk a little bit about India at the end. What do we know about India? Well, the problem is that India once took the international test in the mid-1980s and stopped, and has not been a participant, not been one of the 79 participants in the PISA test or the commensurate to TIMSS test. There are two different major testing things. There's a promise that India will participate in 2021, which I think is important to do, but that's in the future. What can we say? We can try to guess at the performance level from a little bit of evidence of where the Indian population and workforce stands. It's a little bit, I should say at the outset, if you don't measure where you're at, it's really hard to tell whether you're improving or how much you can improve. So that, to me, if you're going to improve the schools, the first thing you have to do, the first thing before anything else, is measure performance of students and the population and to track that over time. If you don't do that, you'll never know what's happening. So what do we know? Let me try to piece together what we know about performance of Indian students. Some of you may know the ACER studies by the Prof organization. ACER has, for the last decade, been testing rural students. So the urban population is left out of this, which is the big hole. But 2/3 of the students in India are rural students. And what you know from that is that 1/4 of students in grade 8 cannot reliably read a second grade sentence. 1/4 of the students in grade 8. Half of the students in grade 5 cannot reliably read a second grade sentence. Those are skills that are going to be absolutely necessary in a world competitive labor force, is to be able to do that. So that's not a good story. Das and Zients, two researchers at Harvard and World Bank, attempted to try to estimate what would the scores on the international TIMSS test. TIMSS is the Trends in International Math and Science study. It's been going on in some form or another for 50 years. What they did was take the published test questions from TIMSS and gave it to a sample of students in Orissa and Rajasthan, and then estimated 2 states took the PISA test in 2009, the same ones that I've been talking about here. And those 2 came out ahead of one country in the world, Kyrgyzstan, and behind 63 countries in the world. Again, I don't have the ability to estimate where those 2 states would fall in the distribution, but it does suggest that there's a challenge. That if, in the long run, India wants to improve its labor force to a point that's world competitive and to get the commensurate growth out of its labor force, it looks like there's a challenge. I'm just going to list a couple things that come out in my mind. There's the Right to Education Act in India in 2009. The problem is that it was not a right to quality education. And what the ACER tests have shown is that at least for the rural population in India, scores fell noticed significantly after the Right to Education Act came into place. The other thing we know from the United States and other countries is that any regional development policy almost certainly has to have a regional education policy. And so when you evaluate development plans for individual states, it should be in the context of what's the education plan for each state. And then I would just say that some of the economic institutions here are really, in fact, making it even harder to get the returns from any improvement in skills of that would come from current schools or improved schools. Well, let me stop and maybe I can answer some questions too. Conclusions are basically development equals growth. There's no other definition that works for development than growth. And growth equals skills. That's the story I'm giving. The value of improvement is enormous. The part that I haven't done until now is that we know from a number of countries of the world that improvement is possible. There's no doubt that some countries have been able to improve their school systems where others haven't. Vietnam has had dramatic improvements in its school system, as has Finland, intelligence and mechanization. And education is the only way to ensure against robots that are coming. And the way to ensure against them is to have better schools. Thank you.
We're open to a few questions. Someone will take the microphone.
Evening, sir. So my question is, can some skilled people lead to overall growth of country?
Pardon me once more?
Can some skilled people lead to overall growth of country rather than making everybody skilled at every level?
I'm not sure that I got it.
Some skilled people lead to
Overall growth of our country.
overall growth of country. So
Yes, that was the, partly I suggested that if you did nothing but increase the number of rocket scientists, which are the top skill groups, rocket scientists defined for the analytical structure are people that are one standard deviation above the average for the OECD, so pretty smart people, that they can lead to growth, as can leading to the bottom of the distribution, improving that. But doing both is where you really get the full gains. And you get the full gains in two ways. One is you get faster growth from having both more rocket scientists and a minimal level of schooling for the population. You get faster gains there. But secondly, when you get to the other political economy issues about the distribution of the gains of growth and who should gain and who shouldn't, you solve that problem by having both everybody in society participating and getting some of the gains. There may still be political economy questions about how much should go to the smart people and how much should go to the bottom, but you're going to help solve that problem by having everybody with a higher skill level and a higher income level.
Hi. So your talk was more about the STEM education kind of setup. So what are the returns from social science education? Because in 2015 there was a story about Japan reducing emphasis on social sciences and schools were getting closed there. So does social science also lead to some impact, or it is? Uh, so the main point is, what is the return from social science education compared to?
So I've been using math scores here because I think they're the best measured skills. It's easier to measure a math test. I, for the life of me, don't understand how they measure reading differences across different countries with different languages. The psychometricians tell me that they think they can do it. I don't understand it. But it turns out that at the country level and at the individual level, people who know more math also are better at reading, know more science, and have no more social science. And so that this skill of math is just a proxy for a broader collection. And so you shouldn't think of it as only emphasizing mathematics. You should think of it as only emphasizing quality schools and writ broadly.
So what would be the impact of new ways of learning in terms of like improving the school quality? So let's say when we are considering the test scores as a measure, right? So earlier only school education was the main driver for it. Let's say a platform like Khan Academy. So people uses such platform of learning, and that might also contribute to the increase in scores, right? So how would be the future study should consider that?
Well, this is a matter of some speculation of what will be the role of technology. I think that technology will have a big part in the future, but it's a technology interacting with quality teachers that's going to be important, that people aren't going to just learn from sitting in front of a screen all day and listening to my buddy Sal Khan to solve little problems. But we haven't seen the answer yet. When I sit in Silicon Valley, I actually get to witness some of the most amazing technological developments in education. Some of them are spectacular, but they haven't yet been able to figure out how to get them into the schools effectively, to use them effectively. I think it's going to be important. I think it's going to be make education more plentiful, or cheaper and more plentiful, by having a combination of technology and teachers. But that's speculation because we don't have many examples yet of having it work effectively. I mean, it's got to work in India, where you have a large remote population and rural population. It's got to be the case at some point that technology is a big element of that, because it's really hard to get high quality teachers to move to these remote areas. But it's possible to move technology to these remote areas with maybe a smaller number of high quality teachers.
Good afternoon, sir. I got two questions. One, does the culture, tradition, societal development, or changing structure of society affect the education, like skills? And second one, you said that you talked about PISA, that is Program for International Students Assessment Test. Now, this test has got any concern with innovations in research? For example, Finland is at number 4 and then skipped to 7, I think, in 2015. And US around 29, 27 to 29. Now, maximum papers or innovations are registered from US, not from Scandinavian countries like Sweden, or because they have got high ranking. However, there is a change in China. China has got reading skill, numerical. So it has got any concern with innovations? Just
So the feedback in the room is
No, I think he's saying that the tests, do they have any link with innovation? So US is 29, but it has highest innovations. Finland is high, but no innovation.
yeah. Okay, so on the innovation part, this is actually a debate in the United States about, well, aren't our schools doing fine, even though we're down at the bottom because we're doing all this innovation? My own view is that the innovation largely comes from the labor market in the way the labor market operates, and not from the schools. The schools give basic skills, but much of the innovation that I see comes from being in Silicon Valley, where people are just experimenting with different things, many of whom were not educated in the United States. You wouldn't believe the quality of Indian grocery stores in Silicon Valley, that we're in fact benefiting from people trained elsewhere, and that's a labor market thing. And schools obviously participate in terms of training people, but I think that most of the innovation comes from the fact that there are really high rewards in the US for innovative technologies, and so people try very hard to come up with innovations.
So in one of your slides, you mentioned that open economies are there is link with the growth, economic growth. But in education setting, it's also observed that most of these high performing education systems are also public education systems. So is there some sort of disconnect where? So what is this black box about?
No, the thing about open technology, open economies, is that they bring in new technologies and different technological inventions from around the world. Open economies allow you to take advantage of what's being done elsewhere, take advantage of some of the intermediate goods produced elsewhere, and so they allow skilled labor to work better in an economy. And so it's not so much how the education is produced, whether it's public education or private education or what have you, except for perhaps the fact that Silicon Valley imports all these people from outside. That's another aspect of open education. But I don't think there's any conflict there. It's that education has its biggest rewards when it can look at the largest set of plans and ideas from around the world and use the technologies from around the world in its own economy.
I think I'm going to take the benefit of the last question.
Okay.
So you had that fantastic thought experiment in which you projected what would happen in the future given business as usual from the past. But supposing robotics does take off like the way you indicated in the end, then it's not just getting basic skills, but it's also lifelong learning that counts.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, how far away are your estimates, from what could happen?
So you're absolutely correct. And lifelong learning has got to be an essential part. What we know from the past is that more educated people actually get more learning along their development path. You've read more books than somebody who has just stopped at the end of secondary schooling, and you are adjusting over time. That's what I was trying to hint at without going into detail about vocational education also. It's not that I'm against teaching people skills, but as you move more and more toward teaching skills, you have to have a plan for how you re-educate, provide more lifelong learning for these people, or else they're going to be left behind. What in the United States I refer to as the Detroit problem, where we had a bunch of workers in Detroit making the only 3 cars that were made in the world, Ford and General Motors and Chrysler. And then all of a sudden, competition came in from abroad and robots came in. And we have a bunch of people in their 40s and 50s sitting in Detroit with no skills, no useful skills at all, because the robots have taken over and they have no way to adjust to a different technology or different kinds of jobs. So my projections have in them sort of the average amount of lifelong learning that we've seen in the past. That may not be sufficient lifelong learning in the future. We might find that we have to devote more attention to lifelong learning. But what they have built in is what we saw with past periods.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
A small memento on behalf of the Institute. What a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'm going to look better. Think of this as a tie. Thank you.
Please join us outside for a cup of tea.